Welcome to the Enigma of Martin Slaught, a gothic fiction novel. Written by H. Wilhelm Starkweather. Narrated by William Heath. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.
Chapter 1. During the year of 1793, I resided in this city. Although my friends urged me to leave, several motives compelled me to stay. However, I won't enumerate these motives or dwell on my current concerns. Instead, I'll recount a few incidents that I encountered during my stay. One evening, as I returned home later than usual, I noticed a man reclining against the wall near my porch. Although my sight was imperfect due to the distance and a far-off lamp, his posture, location, and the time of day suggested that he was sick. I assumed that he was afflicted with the contagious disease that was ravaging the city at the time. Despite this, I approached him to examine him more closely. He leaned his head against the wall, his eyes were closed, and his hands were clasped. His body was supported by the cellar door against which he rested his left shoulder. He seemed to be in a deep lethargy, and my attempts to rouse him were futile. However, his throbbing temples and burning skin indicated a fever that had lasted for some time. The only thing that prevented me from deciding how to help him was my family situation. I lived with my wife and young child, and our maid had been taken to the hospital with the same disease that the man might have. Although we were healthy at the time, we were cautious and followed all the necessary precautions to avoid getting sick. The precautions we took did not involve avoiding places with potential infections, as my job required me to be in their midst every day. Nor did we rely on filling the house with the smell of gunpowder, vinegar, or tar. Our precautions centered around cleanliness, moderate exercise, and a healthy diet. Over time, we had become accustomed to the risks, and it had dulled our fears. When faced with the decision of taking this person into our home and providing him with the necessary care, I sought the advice of my wife. I explained the potential danger of having such a person as a guest and emphasized the importance of her careful judgment. I made it clear that I would abide by her decision without question. I also mentioned the option of sending him to a hospital where he would receive suitable accommodations. However, my wife dismissed the idea, saying, "Let's not talk about hospitals. Let him have a choice. I have no fear, considering the obvious duty at hand. Let us take this poor, unfortunate soul under our protection and care, and trust in the will of heaven for the outcome." I was both expecting and pleased with her proposal. I returned to the sick man and gently woke him from his stupor. With a candle illuminating the room, I had a chance to observe him more closely. He wore simple and untidy clothing, indicating a rustic background. His expression was unassuming and honest, and despite his worn-out appearance, there were remnants of a unique and dignified beauty. He seemed incredibly young, untouched by luxury, and unacquainted with adversity. I can hardly recall encountering anyone who evoked such a powerful and immediate desire to offer affection and help. "You're unwell," I said, attempting to sound as cheerful as possible. "The cold bricks and night air are not fit for a sick man like you. Please come with me to my house where we can provide better accommodations. You need rest and care to recover. I assure you, we will take care of you and provide you with everything you need. All we ask is your cooperation and good spirits." He looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I am fine here. I do not want to trouble you." I insisted, "This is not a suitable place for a sick man. We will find you a doctor and a nurse. Please come with me." He asked, "Why would you risk your safety for me? I have nothing to offer in return." I replied, "If we save your life, that is enough reward. Please come with me." After much persuasion, he agreed to come with me. I took him to a room and stayed by his side all night. My wife had her own duties to tend to, including caring for our healthy baby, but she was frail and needed rest. We tried to make our household chores easier, but they were still quite burdensome for someone who was not accustomed to doing them and had a luxurious education. Adding a sick man to the mix was bound to result in a lot of fatigue. My busy schedule prevented me from always being at home, and taking care of my patient and prescribing the necessary remedies involved many unpleasant and disgusting tasks. Unfortunately, my finances did not allow me to hire any help. My wife, who had a delicate body and a mind that shied away from such duties on regular occasions with fastidious scrupulousness, was to be his primary or sole caregiver. My neighbors were fervent in their well-meaning zeal, and were quick to criticize my rashness and imprudence for exposing my wife, child, and myself to such imminent danger for someone who was probably worthless, and whose disease had most likely been rendered incurable due to negligence or mistreatment. I did not ignore their criticisms. I was aware of all the inconveniences and dangers that I was voluntarily exposing myself to. Nobody valued the life, health, and comfort of the woman I called mine more than I did. I had not forgotten the virulence and activity of this contagion, the dangerous state of my patient, and the uncertainty of his character. However, I was still entirely satisfied with my conduct in this matter. Her willingness and even eagerness to take on the role removed any objections on the part of my friends. I had more faith than others in the curability of this disease and the success of the measures we had taken to protect ourselves from it. No matter what misfortunes may have befallen us, we knew one thing for certain. Neglecting this unfortunate person would cause greater unhappiness than any troubles he may bring. The more we tended to him, the more we felt pleased with ourselves. His pains were severe and prolonged, but even in moments of delirium, his heart overflowed with gratitude, and his only wish was to ease our burden. He exerted himself to perform necessary tasks, suppressing his own feelings, and maintaining a cheerful demeanor to prevent us from worrying about his suffering. He constantly urged his nurse to leave him alone, and showed dissatisfaction whenever she entered his room. In a few days he was out of danger, and in 2 weeks only exercise and nourishment were needed to complete his recovery. During this time, he only gave us general information about himself, revealing that he hailed from Chester County and had come to the city during the epidemic for some important reason. He was not a talkative person, his silence stemming from modesty and unpleasant memories. His features were marked by a solemnity not common in someone his age, and his behavior was characterized by a gravity beyond his years. He claimed to be only 18 years old, but his profound observations suggested a greater maturity. His name was Martin Slaught, and he described himself as having spent his life tending to the plough and threshing floor. He had no formal education and had long been deprived of the love and support of his family. When asked about his plans for the future upon his recovery, he confessed to having no definite direction. He was open to guidance from others and relied on the wisdom that experience would bring. With the whole country before him, he believed he could find work to sustain himself through labor. Unfortunately, his education didn't qualify him for a profession that required higher learning, and his poverty posed a significant obstacle. He couldn't afford to spend time acquiring a trade and needed immediate means of subsistence. Given his circumstances, he saw no other viable option but to pursue what he believed to be the most suitable and fulfilling path, working the land as a farmer. Acknowledging his limited experience and the potential absurdity of making judgments without first-hand knowledge, he couldn't shake the conviction that tending to the soil, planting, and harvesting were the most fitting occupations for a rational being. He envisioned returning to the countryside as soon as his health allowed, seeking employment where available, and fulfilling his responsibilities with loyalty and diligence. I offered him alternative possibilities in the city, suggesting that his familiarity with writing could secure him a position that only required legible handwriting. By adding basic accounting skills, he could find employment in a commercial or public office. However, he objected, stating that his brief experience as a penman proved unsuitable for his well-being. The sedentary nature of the job was incompatible with his health, and he sought a more physically engaging livelihood. He emphasized that he must not sacrifice the ultimate goal for the means to achieve it. Starvation, though a form of suffering, was preferable to a life consumed by monotony and dissatisfaction. He viewed labor as a means of survival, and survival merely as a means of experiencing pleasure. If his tasks only enabled him to survive but deprived him of all enjoyment, they inflicted harm and were to be avoided as greater evils than death. Curious about the specific pleasure he referred to, which seemed incompatible with the work of a clerk, I inquired further. He struggled to articulate it precisely, explaining that he read books whenever he came across them. While his exposure to literature had been limited, he acknowledged that the pleasure he derived from them might be due to their scarcity. However, he firmly stated that a life that entirely forbade him from reading was not to his liking. But this was a minor concern. He valued the thoughts and ideas of others, but could not relinquish the privilege of observing and thinking for himself. He sought a vocation that would allow at least 9/10 of his attention to remain free. If it provided engaging tasks for that portion of his attention that it did demand, all the better. But if not, he would not complain. He would be content with a life where the pleasures outweighed the pains at a ratio of 9-1. He had already tried his hand at being a copyist, under more favorable circumstances than he was likely to encounter again, and found that it did not meet the necessary conditions. On the other hand, he believed that working as a plowman was conducive to health, freedom, and pleasure. The epidemic, if it could be referred to as such, was now subsiding. His young friend's health allowed him to breathe in the fresh air and take walks. A friend of mine named Wortley had been away from the city for 2 months, and during our correspondence, I shared the aforementioned details with him. On the evening of his return, he was hastening to my house when he encountered Slaught, who was also heading in the same direction. Wortley was taken aback to see Slaught enter my dwelling before him, and it quickly dawned on him that this was the young man I had frequently mentioned. I was present when they met, and Wortley's countenance displayed a peculiar mix of satisfaction, surprise, and anger. Slaught, in turn, appeared noticeably uneasy. Wortley's mind seemed preoccupied with some matter, hindering him from engaging in conversation. Before long, he made an excuse to depart, and as he rose, he directed the youth to accompany him home. The tone of his invitation left it uncertain whether it carried a compliment or a threat, intensifying Slaught's unease. He acquiesced without uttering a word, and they left together, leaving my wife and me to discuss the scene. It was impossible not to feel apprehensive. It was clear that they were not strangers to each other. The anger that flashed in Wortley's eyes and the trembling uneasiness of Slaught were disconcerting signs. Wortley was my closest friend, esteemed for his wisdom and integrity. Slaught had seemingly incurred his wrath and contempt. We already anticipated the impact that the revelation of Slaught's unworthiness would have on us. Within half an hour, Slaught returned, transformed from his previous embarrassment to a state of despondency. While he had always been serious, his features were now clouded by deep gloom. The weight of my concern compelled me to address the issue. "Martin," I said, "something is troubling you. Will you not confide in us? Perhaps you find yourself entangled in a dilemma from which we can assist you in escaping. Has anything unpleasant occurred between you and Wortley?" The young man did not respond immediately, appearing unsure of how to answer. After a moment, he admitted that something disagreeable had indeed transpired between him and Wortley. He had unfortunately become associated with a person who had caused harm to Wortley. Although he had played no role in inflicting this harm, he had been threatened with mistreatment, unless he revealed certain information that he possessed, but was morally obligated to withhold. However, disclosing this information would not benefit Wortley. Instead, it would likely have adverse consequences. He paused there, leaving us curious about the nature of these threats. Yet, Slaught implored us not to delve further into the matter. He foresaw the difficulties that would arise from his silence, including the potential loss of our esteem. He knew not what dangers he might face due to Wortley's animosity. Wortley's anger was not entirely unwarranted, as he found himself subject to suspicions that could only be dispelled by breaking his own trust. However, he was uncertain if being more explicit would refute the accusations against him, or if it would only increase his perils by betraying his sacred promise. He had been assigned a challenging role, especially for someone young, careless, and lacking experience. Perhaps sincerity was the best course of action. After deliberation, he might decide to embrace it. In the meantime, he requested permission to retire to his chamber. He couldn't get certain ideas out of his head, even though it was inappropriate to discuss them. He spoke with simplicity and sadness, and showed signs of genuine distress. "Martin," I said, "you have control over your actions and time in this house. You're free to leave whenever you wish, but we're naturally curious to solve this mystery. Anything that could damage or obscure your character will understandably worry us. Wortley isn't quick to judge or blind to the truth. I have so much faith in his honesty that I can't promise my respect to someone who's lost it. I don't know why you're hiding something or what it is you're hiding, but trust me, someone with more life experience than you knows that honesty is always the best policy." As soon as Martin left, I immediately went to see Wortley. He was at home and just as eager to talk as I was. "You remember my disastrous relationship with Thomas Welbeck," he said. "You recall how he vanished suddenly last July, leaving me on the brink of ruin. Even now I'm not sure if I'll survive that event. I spoke to you about the boy who lived with him and how he was seen crossing the river with Welbeck on the night he disappeared. This is that boy. That's why I was so emotional when I saw him at your house. I brought him with me. His confusion made it clear he knows about the things that happened between Welbeck and me. I asked him about Welbeck's fate. To be honest, I had anticipated a well-crafted lie, but instead he simply stated that he had promised to keep the matter confidential, and therefore could not provide me with any information. I inquired if he was aware that his master, or accomplice, or whatever relation he had to him, had absconded while owing me a debt. He acknowledged that he knew it well, but continued to plead his promise of secrecy regarding the whereabouts of the person. This conduct understandably infuriated me, and I treated him with the severity he deserved. I am somewhat ashamed to admit the extent of my anger, as it led me to even strike him. However, he endured my insults with unwavering patience. Undoubtedly the young scoundrel has been well trained in his role, knowing that he can safely defy my authority. From threats, I resorted to pleas. I even attempted to coax the truth from him through deceit. I promised him a portion of the debt if he would help me recover the entire amount. I offered a substantial reward if he would simply provide me with a clue to locate the person in hiding. Yet all my efforts proved insufficient. He merely assumed an air of perplexity and shook his head to indicate his non-compliance. Such was the account given by my friend regarding this encounter. His suspicions were certainly plausible, but I was inclined to give Slaught's behavior a more favorable interpretation. I recalled the destitute and penniless state in which I found him, as well as his consistent amiability and integrity during the time we had known him. These thoughts had a significant influence on my judgment, and made me reluctant to follow my friend's advice, which was to expel Slaught from my home that very night. My wife's strong favor towards this young man further bolstered my inclination to give him the benefit of the doubt. She assured him that she would testify to his innocence before any tribunal, but she agreed with me that we would only continue our friendship on the condition that he disclosed the truth. In return for his confidence, we were willing to guarantee our own secrecy, ensuring that no harm would come to him or his friend as a result of this disclosure. The next morning during breakfast, our guest appeared less visibly embarrassed. His thoughts seemed preoccupied, and little was said until the meal was finished. At that point, I reminded him of the events from the previous day, and expressed that our uneasiness had not subsided, but rather grown over time. I told him that it was within his power, my young friend, to either intensify or alleviate this uneasiness. I admitted that I had no personal acquaintance with Thomas Welbeck, and that I had heard from others that his character had been respectable for a certain period, but eventually he accrued significant debts and absconded without repaying them. It is known that you lived with him, and on the night of his departure, you were seen accompanying him across the river, marking your reappearance on the scene. Welbeck's actions were dishonest, and it is only right that he be pursued to his hiding place and forced to repay his debts. You admit to knowing his place of refuge, but cite a promise of secrecy. Do you not realize that assisting or turning a blind eye to this man's escape was wrong? Promising to aid in his concealment and ensure his impunity through silence only compounded that wrongdoing. However, that is in the past. Your youth and unexplained circumstances may offer some explanation for your misconduct, but you undoubtedly must rectify it to the best of your ability. Consider if revealing the truth will not fix it, spoke the young man. I spent last night pondering on this matter. Before you spoke, I had decided to share my tale with you. I recognize the situation I am in, and understand that only through honesty can I maintain your respect. I made a promise that was foolish to give and wrong to receive, but only the most important reasons would compel me to break it. Disclosing to Welbeck will not harm anyone, and if it does, then his dishonesty justifies my silence. Wortley will not benefit from anything I tell him. My choice to share or withhold information will only affect my own happiness, and my decision is justified. You offered me your protection when I was alone and helpless. You deserve to know who you helped. My fate is linked to Welbeck, and because of your interest in me, my story is worth hearing, even if it lacks variety or skillful storytelling. Wortley may be a good man, despite his anger and unjust treatment towards me, but I do not want him to hear my tale. You, sir, may choose to tell him the important details about Welbeck later, but for now, I ask for your patience as I share my tedious yet humble story. My Eliza's eyes gleamed with joy upon hearing this suggestion. With a fondness akin to that of a sister, she regarded the young man before her. His honesty, in particular, was a true measure of his uprightness in her eyes. She was ready to hear him out and forgive any mistakes he might make due to his youth and impulsiveness. Though I did not share her enthusiasm, I was more than willing to lend an ear to his story. However, my prior commitments meant that we had to wait until late in the evening to begin. Finally, gathered around a warm and welcoming fire, with no chance of interruption from the outside world, and our little one sound asleep, Slaught took a moment to gather his thoughts before beginning his tale. Chapter 2. I was born and raised in Chester County. My father owned a small farm that he maintained through hard work to support our large family. Despite having many children, all of them except for me died at the young age of 19 or 20 due to a defect in our mother's constitution. As a result, I have always been aware that I too may meet a premature fate. Last year my mother passed away after burying her 5th child. I have always had a frail constitution, but until her death, I was indulged and given free rein during my breaks from labor. My mother's gentle nature, caring attitude, and deference to my opinions and talents have always stayed with me. In my youth, I acted thoughtlessly and presumptuously towards my mother, but now that she is gone, I am filled with regret for my treatment of her. While I never openly rebelled against her, I know that I could have treated her with more respect and love. Her demeanor seemed designed to make me rebellious and difficult. Despite my flaws, I quickly repented, and even in the midst of impatience and anger, a single look of gentle reproach from her was enough to bring me to tears and make me submissive to her will. If mourning her loss can serve as atonement for the wrongs I committed during her life, then I have certainly made ample amends. My father was a man of limited intelligence, but possessed a flexible temperament. He was diligent and sober by nature, and content to be guided by the superior intellect of my mother. Under her tutelage, he prospered. However, when she passed, his affairs quickly began to show signs of neglect and incompetence. Although my own intelligence may have qualified me to assist and advise my father, I was entirely inexperienced in the role of supervisor. Furthermore, I did not inherit my mother's gentleness and fortitude, both of which were essential qualities for a young boy attempting to guide his elderly parent. Perhaps with time, I may have gained the necessary skills, or my father might have developed greater prudence. However, an unexpected event altered the course of my life. Betty Lawrence was a wild girl from the pine forests of New Jersey. At the age of 10, she became a bound servant in the city, and after completing her term, she sought employment in my father's neighborhood. She was hired as a milkmaid and market woman for our family. Her features were rough, her frame sturdy, her mind uneducated, and her morals lacking in the qualities that are typically associated with female excellence. Despite this, she possessed a surplus of good health and good humor, and was a tolerable companion in the fields or the barnyard. After the death of my mother, she was elevated to a somewhat higher position. She was still tasked with the same duties, but now had some degree of control over when and how they were performed. The cows and the dairy were her responsibility, but nobody interfered or tried to dictate her methods. She seemed capable of handling this domain, and as long as my father was satisfied with her management, I had no objections. This routine continued without much change for several months. My father's behavior towards Betty did catch my attention, but it didn't cause any alarm. He occasionally deferred to her advice or requests, which I attributed to his weak mind that made him easily influenced by others. I never thought that she had any deeper or long-term ambitions. However, her demeanor did start to shift visibly. She adopted a haughty and pretentious attitude, and began dressing in brighter and more fashionable clothes. I teased her about having a new lover, and joked about his qualities. A boorish man was often seen visiting her, and his attention was not rebuffed. It was assumed that he was the one she was interested in. When I pointed him out as her favorite, she expressed great indignation, and hinted that her goals were higher than that. I thought this was just a typical denial, and assumed that his continued visits proved that he was the one. I often spoke to my father about Betty's change in behavior and speculated on the reasons behind it. Whenever I brought up this topic, he became distant and unresponsive. He either gave short answers or tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, or simply left the room altogether. Although it was surprising, no one seemed to give much thought to this behavior. My father was advanced in years, and the grief from losing his wife had left a lasting impression. Even after half a year had passed, he still seemed to be mourning. Betty had picked her partner, and I was expecting to receive an invitation to the wedding any day. One afternoon she dressed herself in her finest clothes and started getting ready for what seemed to be an important event. My father had instructed me to prepare the horse and carriage. When I asked where he was going, he replied vaguely that he had some business a few miles away. I offered to go in his place, but he said it was impossible. As he walked away, he directed me to inform him when the carriage was ready, and to take his place overseeing the workers in the field while he was gone. I did as he asked, but before calling him back from the field, I had a brief chat with the milkmaid who was sitting on a bench, all dressed up and waiting expectantly. I teased her imaginary lover for being late, and declared my eternal hatred for them both for not making me a bridesmaid. She listened, looking embarrassed, exultant, and sometimes malicious. I eventually left her and didn't return home until late. When I entered the house, my father introduced Betty to me as his new wife and asked me to treat her as a mother. It took multiple solemn declarations from both of them before I believed what had happened. The impact on my emotions was clear. I knew that the woman was uncivilized, uneducated, and immoral. If only I had known what was to come, I could have helped my father avoid the path that led him to ruin. But my arrogance blinded me to the danger. The thought of this woman taking the place of my beloved mother was unbearable. I couldn't bring myself to treat her with the respect she didn't deserve, and I struggled to control my anger and disdain toward her. Being reduced to her servant, subject to her malice and deceit, was not something I could tolerate. I had no independent means of support, but as my father's only child, I had hoped to inherit his estate. I had countless plans and dreams for what I would do with the land and the wealth it would bring. But those hopes were now shattered. I knew that this woman would only act in her own interest, and would not hesitate to destroy mine. She had no taste or refinement, and her numerous, needy relatives would quickly drain my father's resources. She hated me because she knew she had wronged me because I held her in contempt, and because I had caught her in a scandalous affair with a neighbor's son. The house that had been my home was now no longer mine, nor my father's. I used to feel like a master in that house, but now I felt like an outsider and an enemy. All ties that once bound me were either dissolved or transformed into something that pushed me away. I was a guest who was tolerated with anger and impatience. I knew that I had to leave, but I didn't know where to go or what kind of work to seek. My father had emigrated from Scotland and had no family on this side of the ocean. My mother's family lived in New Hampshire, but we had been separated for so long that the ties of kinship had faded away. Farming was my only profession, but to profit from it, I would have to become a day laborer working for strangers. This was a destiny that I, who had enjoyed the pleasures of independence and command for so long, could not accept. I thought that perhaps the city might offer me a refuge. It was only a short journey away, but I had only been there a few times before for brief visits. I didn't know anyone there and was ignorant of its ways and dangers. I was not qualified for any employment that was compatible with city life except writing. Writing had always been a favorite tool of mine, and although it may seem strange, I had almost as much experience with a pen as I did with a hoe. My skills were limited to writing legibly. I had only used it to transcribe the words of others or to give shape to my own ideas. I had no way of knowing whether the city would offer me employment as a mere copyist that would be sufficiently lucrative. My decision to leave was hastened by the behavior of my new mother. I had guessed correctly about how she would treat me. In a short time, my father's demeanor became sullen and austere. He gave orders in a commanding tone, and any failure to carry them out was met with a rebuke. Eventually, these rebukes were accompanied by hints that I was now old enough to provide for myself. It was time for me to find a job that would allow me to earn a living. My father had gained his wealth through hard work, and I should do the same. At first, I felt angry and saddened by these hints. I knew where they came from, but I couldn't express my feelings in front of my father. However, my looks spoke volumes, and being around him became unbearable. Despite my emotions, I couldn't ignore the weight of my father's words. He had given me life, but it was up to me to provide for myself. He didn't control me. He merely did what he wanted with his own resources. He encouraged me to use my freedom to my advantage and make something of myself. I realized that there were many other manual labor jobs besides farming. Carpentry and cabinet making seemed like good options, even though I had no experience in those trades. I didn't need to serve a 7-year apprenticeship to learn the necessary skills. A master in the field might be willing to take me under his wing, and I could learn in just a few years. Perhaps my father would even agree to support me financially while I learned. Living on less than what I was willing to do was no easy feat. I shared my thoughts with my father, hoping for some assistance in executing my plans. He commended my intentions, but said he had no room for my endeavors, as he already had full employment for all his profits. He suggested that if I bound myself to serve for 4 or 5 years, my master would take care of my subsistence. However, I was to look for nothing from him. He reminded me that I had shown little regard for his happiness, and refused to show respect to a woman who was entitled to it as his relation. He believed it was only right that I maintain myself from then on. He had no use for my services on the farm, and the sooner I left his house, the better. I left the conversation with a newfound resolution to follow his advice. I realized that I had to be my own protector, and wondered why I had stayed under his roof for so long. Leaving was now essential, and there was no reason to delay my departure for even a single hour. I decided to head to the city and apprentice myself to a mechanical trade. I was aware of the constraints and the uncertainty of finding the right master, but I hoped that fate would suggest another option that would allow me to earn a living without sacrificing my liberty. I planned to begin my journey the following day. The prospect of such a significant change in my life left me sleepless that night. I spent the night pondering the future and imagining the adventures that lay ahead. The knowledge of man is directly proportional to his foresight. It's no surprise, then, that in my state of profound ignorance, I had no inkling of the events that were about to unfold. I was a curious person, but there was nothing in the scene I was headed toward that piqued my interest. To me, the inevitable companions of a city were discord, foul smells, unappetizing food, unhealthy labor, and tiresome company. My best clothes were of the plainest material and design. I had only 3 checkered shirts in my linen collection. Since my mother's passing, I spent my winter evenings knitting my own stockings. I had 3 pairs, one of which I wore, and the other 2, along with 2 shirts, were bundled up. As far as money went, I had only 3 quarter-dollar pieces to my name. Chapter 3. At the crack of dawn, I arose from my bed without a word of goodbye or a blessing. I headed out onto the road leading to the city, which ran close to my house. I had no regrets about leaving anything behind, as I had purchased most of my own books with the fruits of my own labor. However, there were only a few books in my possession, and I had memorized them all through constant study. Therefore, they were of no further use to me, and I left them behind without a second thought for the mice to make their home in. Despite the reasons for despair and anxiety that came with my situation, I walked down this unfamiliar path with the fearlessness that only youth can provide. My heart was light, and my spirits were high. Now, I thought to myself, I am a man. I must work hard and make a name for myself. With my intellect in my hands, it would be strange if I could not secure an honest living. I decided to embark on my journey, and after traveling for several miles, hunger began to gnaw at my stomach. I knew I could stop at a nearby farmhouse and ask for breakfast without paying, but I hesitated. I still had some money in my pocket, and I felt reluctant to beg when I had the means to buy a meal. I thought to myself that perhaps I could find a tavern where I could purchase some coarse bread and a little milk at a reasonable price. Just as I entertained this idea, I noticed a signpost indicating the presence of an inn nearby. It seemed like fate, and I couldn't bring myself to justify begging when there was an inn within reach. So I decided to stop and have breakfast there. The landlord greeted me warmly and was attentive to my needs. However, as I tasted the bread, it was stale, the milk was sour, and the cheese was incredibly unappetizing. Despite my disappointment, I refrained from mentioning the quality of the food. I reasoned that the inn probably couldn't offer anything better. Once I finished my unsatisfactory meal, I silently handed over one of my coins as payment. I believed this act displayed my generosity and a sense of nobility. I never held much regard for those who haggled over prices, so I felt this was the right way to handle the situation. The landlord accepted the money with a courteous bow and said, "Just the money, sir. You're on foot, sir. A pleasant way of traveling, sir. I wish you a good day, sir." With that, he promptly walked away. To my surprise, I didn't receive any change. I was taken aback, and for a moment the urge to call him back and question the fairness of the transaction crossed my mind. However, a moment's reflection made me realize the futility of such a confrontation. It would only serve to prolong the encounter and further dampen my spirits. So, with a slightly deflated mood, I continued my journey, pondering the unexpected turn of events. I've heard stories of travelers and adventurers in the desert who would give away a chest of jewels for a simple cup of water. I never thought I'd be in a similar situation, but here I was, having just spent a third of my estate on breakfast. I stopped at another inn at noon, hoping to get a similar meal for the same price. However, I was surprised to find a large group of people enjoying a lavish feast. The landlord invited me to join them, but I was only served bread and milk. When I asked the landlord how much I owed for the meal, he seemed hesitant. "Did you drink anything else, sir?" he asked. "No, just the milk," I replied. After a moment of deliberation, he decided to waive the club fee since I didn't have any alcohol. "A simple dinner is $50, sir," he said. I was already halfway through my journey, but my purse was completely empty. This was the high cost of living at an inn. If I wanted to stay in the city, I would have to find a tavern to stay at. But I didn't have any money left to pay for it. My father used to have a boarder who paid $1 a week, and I was willing to live on even less and sleep on a harder bed if I had to. That's why I had been so careless with my money in the first place. But now, I didn't know what to do. Going back to my father's house wasn't an option. Abandoning my plan to enter the city and instead seeking temporary refuge or even permanent employment at one of the nearby plantations seemed like the most sensible course of action. Despite these deliberations, I did not slow my pace. Lost in thought, I suddenly realized that I had already passed Squillkill at the upper bridge and was now within the city limits as night quickly approached. I needed to make a decision quickly. Then, it occurred to me that I had not paid the customary toll at the bridge, and I did not have the necessary funds to do so. If I were to be stopped for payment, it would hinder my progress and prevent me from fulfilling my destiny. I could not turn back and awaken the toll-gatherer's vigilance, as I had no means to pay. Let it stand, I thought. I will pay when I am able. I continued on my way until I reached Market Street. The night had fallen, and the triple row of lamps that illuminated the street presented a breathtaking and unfamiliar sight. I had never been to the city at this hour before. The novelty of everything I saw was almost overwhelming. Despite my personal concerns, I was completely engrossed in the new and exciting sensations that surrounded me. I walked more carefully now, still taking in the sights and sounds of the city. Eventually, I reached the market house, where I indulged myself in even more wonder and amazement. I gazed around at the magnificent buildings, taking in the grandeur and opulence that surrounded me. It was a stark contrast to the humble and tranquil environment I was accustomed to. For a fleeting moment, I felt as though I had been transported to a hall adorned with dazzling lights and radiant decorations, reminiscent of the grandest of spectacles. The swiftness with which I had transitioned from my modest retreat to this bustling city seemed almost miraculous or magical. I continued walking through the city, moving from one impressive building to another, until I reached the end of the avenue at Front Street. There I was compelled to pause and seek respite for my weary body by sitting on a nearby stall. It was no surprise that fatigue began to set in after such a long journey. Excluding the brief breaks for breakfast and dinner, I had been traveling for 15 hours, covering a distance of 45 miles. The realization of my physical exertion began to sink in. At that moment, I started to ponder my predicament with greater seriousness. I was a stranger in this bustling metropolis, devoid of friends and lacking any money to my name. I couldn't afford the basic necessities of food and shelter, and the act of begging was unfamiliar and unpalatable to me. Hunger was the most immediate and pressing concern I faced. I contemplated spending the night right there on the spot where I sat, with no fear of being disturbed by the watchful eye of the police. It was not a crime to be without a home. However, the question loomed. How would I satisfy my current hunger, and the hunger that would surely follow on the morrow? Finally, a thought struck me. Perhaps one of my fellow countrymen from the rural area had made their way to the city. I knew of one such person, a simple and well-intentioned individual who not only cultivated a farm, but also ran a store. If I were fortunate enough to encounter him, His familiarity with the city could prove invaluable in my current destitute circumstances. Moreover, his generosity might lead him to lend me enough money to purchase a single meal, providing some temporary relief from my pressing hunger. I had made up my mind to leave the city the following day, chastising myself for the foolishness that had led me here in the first place. However, in the meantime, I had to address my immediate physical needs. "Bust, where could I find this acquaintance of mine?" During our previous conversations, I vaguely recalled him mentioning the place where he was temporarily staying, a tavern. However, the name of the establishment or the sign associated with it eluded my memory for some time. After a considerable effort, I finally managed to remember that it was Lesher's Tavern. With that information in hand, I set off on my quest to find it. After numerous inquiries and directions, I eventually reached the doorstep of the tavern. Just as I was about to enter, a sinking feeling washed over me. I realized that my bundle was missing. I had absent-mindedly left it behind on the stall where I had been sitting. The constant flow of people passing by surely would not have overlooked such an opportunity. It was highly likely that someone had taken it for themselves. Yet, despite the slim chances, the bundle held too much value for me to be resigned to its loss based solely on speculation. Without wasting a moment, I made up my mind to go back and search for it. Retracing my steps proved to be a challenging task, but I persisted. However, upon my return, I found that the bundle had indeed vanished. The clothes within it held little monetary worth individually, but collectively they constituted my entire wardrobe. I realized that they could have been exchanged for food through pawning or selling. I comforted myself by thinking that perhaps someone else in dire straits had found use for my shirts and stockings, providing them with much-needed warmth and covering. However, there was one item within the bundle that I could hardly bear to lose. It was a portrait of a young man who had passed away 3 years ago, while residing at my father's house. The portrait was a creation of his own hand. He had been discovered one morning in our orchard, displaying signs of madness. His demeanor and attire suggested a certain status and wealth. The loss of my clothing was manageable, but the disappearance of this portrait felt like a profound blow. It held immense sentimental value for me, serving as a lasting memory of the young man's tragic fate. My mother was a kind and compassionate woman, and when a peculiar young man named Clavering appeared on our doorstep, she was quick to offer him asylum. Despite his incoherent ramblings about a faithless mistress, we found him harmless and deserving of our help, even though he was unable to pay for it. Clavering was a strange character, careless about his health and appearance, and he eventually succumbed to a fever that he had contracted through his own neglect. He claimed to have come from a wealthy family in England, but he offered little information beyond that. He had been banished to America by his family, he said, after they had denied him the woman he loved and refused him any means of support. Despite his odd behavior, my mother took a liking to Clavering, seeing in him a resemblance to me. I, too, felt drawn to him, for reasons I could not explain. He was an artist of some skill, and he drew a portrait of himself shortly before his death. He gave it to me as a keepsake, and I treasured it as a reminder of our brief friendship. When I left home, I made sure to take the portrait with me, wrapping it carefully in paper and inscribing a few lines of poetry in my own hand. I placed it in a leather case, which I then secured in the center of my bundle. Some might have thought it safer to keep it on my person, but I felt that it was better protected this way. My opinion differed from the rest, and now I was to pay the price for my mistake. No amount of cursing myself or dwelling on my regrets would change the situation. I decided to return to the tavern and ask about Mr. Capper, my father's neighbor. I was informed that he had stayed there the previous night and planned to do so again, but had accepted an invitation from a stranger to stay with him tonight. The landlord had no information about the gentleman's identity. Mr. Capper was not expected to return in the morning as he had agreed to accompany the stranger to the countryside. I felt the weight of disappointment settle upon me. I had carelessly lost the only chance to meet my friend. Had I arrived just a few minutes earlier, I could have secured a meeting. I could think of no other solution to my problem. Despair began to take hold of me. Memories of my childhood flooded my mind, and I thought of my mother. I shuddered at the thought of my father's infatuation with Betty, the dreadful usurper. I felt like the most miserable and lonely person in the world. I sat in the common room, surrounded by others who were singing, whistling, or lounging. I paid them no attention, and instead let myself be consumed by my thoughts. As I sat on the bench, someone approached me and spoke up. "Excuse me, sir, but may I ask who you were looking for just now? I may be able to help you out." I turned to face the speaker, a young man dressed in expensive and fashionable clothing. He had a pleasant demeanor and an intelligent look in his eyes. I described the man I was searching for, and to my surprise, he revealed that he was also looking for the same person. "He promised to meet me here at 9:30, the young man said confidently. "I have no doubt he will show up, so you'll have the chance to meet him too." I was grateful for the information and thanked him warmly. He then invited me to join him for supper as a means of passing the time. Though I hesitated, knowing I couldn't afford to pay for my meal, I eventually accepted his offer. As we dined, my companion proved to be a great conversationalist with a frank and good-humored manner. I found myself opening up to him about my past and my future plans. He listened attentively and offered some wise advice, though his words also made me doubt my decision to stay in the city. Despite our enjoyable conversation, the hour grew late, and the man we were both waiting for failed to appear. I expressed my concern, but my companion suggested that he may have simply forgotten or neglected his promise. The news of my lost bundle was certainly disheartening, and this man noticed the immediate change in my demeanor. He quickly grasped that the matter he wanted to discuss was not of the utmost importance, and could be easily set aside for a later time. He pestered me to reveal the cause of my distress, and took great delight in teasing me once he learned what had happened. Regarding the expense of supper, he insisted that it should be his treat, since he had invited me to join him. As for lodging, he generously offered to share his own chamber and bed with me. His continuous acts of kindness surpassed any expectations I had formed, leaving me astounded and wondering. I couldn't fathom why I was being treated with such benevolence. I saw no reason why I, in particular, should be the recipient of such generosity. While I believed that I would act similarly if placed in his position, his behavior still seemed incongruous and inexplicable. I reflected on the source of my ideas about human nature. They certainly didn't originate solely from my own feelings and experiences. My instincts tended to make me suspicious and skeptical, attributing acts of kindness to hidden and ulterior motives rather than to genuine and praiseworthy intentions. I paused to consider the possible designs and motives behind this person's behavior. What could he possibly gain from treating me in this manner? I posed no threat or opportunity for deceit. I possessed neither valuable trinkets nor coins to entice the treachery of others. What was being offered to me was merely a place to spend the night. Was this an act of such extraordinary selflessness that it seemed unbelievable? True, my appearance was more humble compared to that of my companion, but my intellectual abilities were at least on par with his. Why should it be assumed that he would be indifferent to my needs and deserving of his kindness? I may have been a young man lacking experience, money, and friends, but I still possessed certain mental and personal qualities that warranted consideration and empathy. As I contemplated whether to accept my new friend's invitation, he persistently urged me to join him. He noticed my hesitation but attributed it to the wrong reason. "You're probably afraid of being thrown into a gathering of unfamiliar faces. People like you, who have led a more secluded life, tend to feel uncomfortable around strangers. But it's already bedtime for our family, so we can put off your introduction to them until tomorrow. We can slip into our room without being noticed by anyone except the servants." Until that moment, I hadn't been aware of this particular circumstance. My reluctance stemmed from a different cause, but now that the inconveniences of formalities were mentioned, they seemed significant to me. I was relieved that we could avoid unnecessary ceremonial introductions, so I agreed to accompany him. We walked through several streets, making turns along the way. Finally, we entered a courtyard that appeared to be mostly occupied by stables. "We'll take the back way into the house," he explained. "That way we won't have to go through the parlor where some family members might still be lingering." He remained as talkative as ever, but he didn't share anything that would provide insight into the number, character, or circumstances of his family. Chapter 4. As we approached the brick wall, a gate opened to reveal a vast courtyard. The darkness enveloped us, obscuring everything but the rough outlines of the buildings that loomed before me. Compared to my father's small wooden hovel, these structures were massive and imposing. The horses were clearly treated with more care and attention than I had ever been. We passed through a large door and entered a grand hall. "Wait here," he instructed me, "while I fetch a light." He returned quickly, candle in hand, before I had a chance to fully comprehend my surroundings. We climbed up a staircase that was covered in painted canvas. I cannot describe the overwhelming sensations I felt from the grandeur and magnificence of everything around me. The height of the stairs, the size of the room, and the lavish decorations all left me in awe. We finally arrived at the 3rd floor, where my companion unlocked a chamber and welcomed me in. I barely had a chance to observe the room before the candle was accidentally extinguished. "Damn my carelessness," he exclaimed. "I must go down and light the candle. I'll be back in a moment. In the meantime, feel free to undress and go to bed." He left the room, and I recalled that he had locked the door behind him. Despite his suggestion, my curiosity demanded that I take a closer look at the room. The starlight and the dim glow of a nearby street lamp allowed me to make out the room's vastness and height. The floor was covered in a thick carpet, the walls were adorned with vibrant hangings, and the bed and windows were draped in curtains of a rich texture and color. I had only read about such opulence and lavishness, and yet here I was, standing in the midst of it all. I could hardly believe that this was real, and it seemed like a dream. I wondered where this adventure would lead me and how it would end. Tomorrow I would leave for the countryside at dawn, but tonight would be forever etched in my memory. I knew that if I ever shared this story, people would doubt its truth, and I would be compared to the storytellers of Shiraz and Baghdad. As I pondered these thoughts, I noticed that he was taking an awfully long time to return. He left just to relight his candle, a task that could have been accomplished numerous times during the time he was gone. I couldn't help but wonder why he was taking so long. Was there an unforeseen mishap causing the delay? Another interval passed, yet there were no signs of his return. Unease began to settle in, and I struggled to find an explanation for his prolonged absence. Was there a sinister plot at play? I approached the door, only to discover that it was locked. This heightened my suspicions. I was alone, a stranger, confined to an upper room in the house. If my companion had intentionally or accidentally disappeared, and a member of the family were to find me here, what would be the consequences? Would I be mistaken for a thief and thrown into prison? The speed at which I had been brought from the street to this room would be nothing compared to the swiftness of my journey from here to jail. These thoughts filled me with panic, and the more I contemplated them, the more plausible they seemed. No doubt I had fallen victim to a malicious scheme. However, my inclination fought against these dark thoughts, and my fears began to recede. What motive, I questioned, could drive a person to inflict such unwarranted harm? Although I couldn't explain the delay, countless possibilities could account for it. These reflections provided some comfort, albeit momentarily. I strained my ears, listening intently for the sound of approaching footsteps, when suddenly a noise broke the silence. It was not the sound of footsteps, but rather a struggle of human breath, as if gasping for air. At first it resembled a groan, but its origin remained unclear. The source of the sound was nearby, perhaps even within the room. Shortly after, the same noise repeated, accompanied by a movement as if someone was adjusting their position. What initially seemed like a groan now appeared to be nothing more than the sound of someone sleeping and breathing. What can be inferred from this incident? My companion failed to inform me that the apartment was already occupied. Was his deception meant to be playful or malicious? There was no need for contemplation. There were no available hiding spots or means of escape. Sooner or later the person would awaken and discover my presence. The waiting period would only be filled with agony, and it was wise to shorten it. Should I not draw back the curtain, awaken the individual, and face the consequences of my situation head-on? I moved silently towards the bed when a thought struck me. What if the person sleeping is a woman? The mixture of dread and shame that coursed through my veins is indescribable. I contemplated how such an unexpected visitor might be perceived through a woman's fears, the hasty alarms that could be raised, the harm I might unknowingly cause or unjustly suffer. These thoughts threw my mind into painful confusion. My mere presence could tarnish an untainted reputation or ignite feelings of jealousy. Yet even if it were a woman, would it not be less harmful to gently interrupt her slumber? However, the question of gender still remained unanswered. To resolve this, I approached the bed once again and pulled aside the silk curtain. The dim glow of a street lamp revealed that the sleeper was an infant. Some of my concerns were now alleviated. It was evident that this room belonged to a nurse or a mother. She had not yet retired to bed. Perhaps it belonged to a married couple, and their return could be imminent. I imagined their arrival and my own inevitable discovery. I could envision no outcome that wasn't disastrous and horrific, and I was determined to escape it at any cost. I examined the door once more and determined that exiting through that path was impossible. However, there were other doors in the room, and I needed to explore any viable options in this desperate situation. One of these doors was bolted shut. I unlocked it, and a spacious area beyond. Should I confine myself within this closet? I couldn't discern any ultimate benefit from doing so. However, I did notice a bolt on the inside, which would provide some measure of security. With it engaged, the door couldn't be opened without being forcibly broken. I barely had a moment to consider when I heard the long-awaited sound of footsteps in the entryway. Was it my companion, or a stranger? If it were the latter, I hadn't yet gathered enough courage to face them. I can't commend the bravery of my actions, but one can hardly expect audacious or prudent choices from someone in my predicament. I stepped into the closet and closed the door. Shortly after, someone unlocked the chamber door. The footsteps on the carpet were barely audible. Impatiently, I waited for some indication that could guide my actions. I pressed my ear against the keyhole and finally heard a voice, though it wasn't my companion's. It exclaimed, just above a whisper, "Smiling cherub, safe and sound, I see. I hope my experiment succeeds, and that you find a mother as I have found a wife." The speaker paused, seemingly kissing the baby, and then withdrew, locking the door behind him. These words held no coherent meaning. However, they assured me at the very least that I had been deceived. It was evident that this chamber did not belong to my companion. I prayed to my deity for deliverance from these snares. What a wretched state I was in, enveloped in tangible darkness, confined to this unfamiliar hiding place, lurking like a thief. My thoughts were interrupted by new sounds. The door was unlocked and more than one person entered the room, casting light through the keyhole. I attempted to look, but the aperture was too small, and the figures passed by too swiftly to allow me a glimpse. I strained my ears, hoping to gather more information. The man who had just left was speaking again, though in a hushed tone. I could tell from the rustling of silk that he was in the company of a woman. Whatever he said caused her to burst into tears, and he tried to console her with gentle words and affectionate names. "It can't be helped," he said. "You need to be strong for yourself and for me. You must overcome this irrational grief." He repeated these words several times, but they seemed to have little effect on the inconsolable woman. Eventually her sobs subsided, and he urged her to rest. They fell silent for a few minutes, and I couldn't help but wonder if they might discover my hiding place. I had no idea how to behave if they did. I had lost the privilege of standing upright, and the thought of spending the night cramped in that closet was unbearable. I began to consider the possibility of bursting out and telling them the truth, hoping they would believe me. I put my hand on the latch several times, but always hesitated and withdrew. When my resolve faltered, I thought back to my plan. I would tell them everything, leaving out no details of my journey here. Surely my story would resonate with someone they knew. All I desired was the freedom to leave, but if that was not an option, I hoped to avoid mistreatment and confront my betrayer. With these thoughts in mind, I attempted to unlock the door once more. Suddenly the lady let out a piercing scream and cried, "Oh my God, what is this?" This led to an intriguing conversation. The source of her shock was a child. From what was said, it was clear that she had no prior knowledge of the infant's existence. Her husband acted as if he was equally unaware of the situation. He joined in with her exclamations of surprise and wild guesses. As soon as her initial shock subsided, he suggested that they take care of the foundling. It was revealed that her recent sorrow was due to the loss of her own child. Initially, she was hesitant to accept her husband's proposal, but eventually, she agreed to take the baby to her bosom and feed it. This event had diverted my attention from my original plan, and instead prompted me to ponder the nature of the situation. One possible explanation was that the husband was the father of the child, and had used this unusual method to guarantee the child's safety under his wife's maternal care. The child would soon elicit the same affection that she had for her own children. It was unlikely that anyone would suspect the child's true parentage. If the lady was like most women, the revelation of this truth might transform her love into hatred. I was amazed by how easily human emotions could be swayed, and by the convoluted chain of events that had led me to uncover this truth. The falsehoods we create to oppose the natural order of things are flimsy and weak. Even if I manage to escape from this hiding place undetected, I will always know the secrets of these two individuals. My situation is now even more precarious. The lights have been extinguished and everyone is asleep. Leaving the closet now would be too risky. My plans are once again foiled. However, their conversation continues, and I feel justified in listening. They mention many secret and important matters, some of which are unclear to me, but every word they speak is etched into my memory. Perhaps my unique circumstances and previous ignorance of the world make me a greedy listener. Though I will forget most of what was said, there is one part of the conversation that I must repeat. That night, a large group had gathered at their home, and they discussed the character and behavior of several people. Eventually, the husband asked, "What do you think of the nabob, especially when he talks about his wealth? He's so clever in making people think he's poor, but no one believes him. I can't figure out his scheme. I suspect his wealth comes from a bad source since he's so secretive about it." The lady replied, "Perhaps you're mistaken about his wealth." The husband scoffed. "Impossible. Look at how he lives. I've seen his bank account. He's deposited $500,000 since he arrived here." "May it be true by the grace of heaven," responded the lady, accompanied by a sigh. "I will consider your scheme with less aversion. If poor Tom's fortune can be made, and he is not significantly worse off, or only slightly worse off as a result, then I will think it is overall the best course of action," expressed the lady with a sigh. "That is precisely what reassures me about the plan. To him, 30,000 is inconsequential," replied the individual. "But won't he suspect your involvement?" inquired the lady. "How could he? Won't I appear to suffer losses alongside him? Tom may be my brother, but who can vouch for a brother's honesty? He cannot suspect either of us. Only a miracle could expose our plot. Besides, this man is not what he seems. He will eventually be revealed as a great impostor. He acquires wealth through means other than legitimate trade. He has somehow gained access to the Portuguese treasury." At this point, the conversation shifted, and eventually the tranquility of sleep settled in. I pondered, who is this wealthy individual, who counts his dollars in the millions, and upon whom it seems fraud is being plotted? Amidst their caution and cunning, they remain oblivious that their conversation has been overheard. Through mysterious means, much like those that brought me here, I may in the future be able to benefit from uncovering this plot. But for now, what was my course of action? How could I escape from this perilous refuge? After much contemplation, I realized that it might not be entirely impossible to leave the premises without arousing their suspicion. Sleep does not typically end abruptly unless at a specific time. What obstacles stood between me and freedom that I could discreetly overcome? Movement and sound inevitably go hand in hand, but not every sound is given attention. The doors of the closet and the chamber did not produce any creaking sounds as they opened. After some experimentation, I determined that the latter might be locked. If that was the case, the key was likely still in the lock and could be used without much noise. I bided my time until the slow and hoarse breathing of both occupants indicated that they were sound asleep. As I shifted my position, however, my head collided with some objects hanging from the closet ceiling. The implements clattered together, and I feared that the noise would awaken the sleepers, as the closet was not far from the bed. Indeed, the husband's breathing stopped abruptly, and he lifted his head from the pillow. His companion, roused by his movement, asked what was wrong. "I believe there's something in the closet," he replied. "If I wasn't dreaming, I heard the pistols clashing together as if someone was taking them down." This suggestion was enough to frighten the woman, who begged her husband to investigate. To my horror, he initially agreed, but then reconsidered, suggesting that his ears might have deceived him. Perhaps it was just a rat or his imagination. I was filled with anxiety as I listened to their conversation, realizing how easily they could be disturbed from their slumber. Eventually, all was quiet once more, and I resumed my attempt to escape. I carefully withdrew the bolt, trying to minimize any sound, but it was impossible to avoid making some noise, and my nerves were on edge as I divided my attention between the bolt and the sleepers. It was a delicate balance, requiring just enough force to release the lock without waking the couple. It took at least 15 minutes to complete the task at hand. Finally, success was achieved, and the door was opened with great care. As I emerged from the pitch-black room, The light streaming in from the 3 windows illuminated the space significantly. Objects that were previously invisible to me upon entering the room were now clearly discernible. Though the bed was draped with curtains, I still retreated into hiding, afraid of being seen. To make my escape easier, I removed my shoes. My mind was so preoccupied with more pressing matters that I never considered the importance of taking them with me. I left them behind in the closet. I glided across the room towards the door, only to be disheartened when I realized that the key was missing. My entire plan hinged on the possibility that the door had been left unlocked. In my haste to confirm this, I made a noise that startled one of the sleepers. He woke up and demanded to know who was there. I felt as though my fate was sealed, and that I would inevitably be caught. My fear kept me silent as I cowered against the wall, waiting for the moment that would determine my destiny. The woman was woken up again and asked her husband about the disturbance. He replied that someone may have been at the door, but that there was no danger of them entering since he had locked it and had the key in his pocket. This news completely crushed my spirit. I had no more options left, and my resources were depleted. I could only wait in that spot until morning light, which couldn't be far off, revealed me. My lack of experience made it impossible for me to fully comprehend the dangers of my situation. Perhaps I had nothing more to fear than temporary discomfort. My intentions were pure, and I'd only ended up in this predicament due to the wickedness of others, not my own. The ambiguousness surrounding my intentions and the scrutiny they would face deeply troubled me. The mere thought of being associated with thieves sent shivers down my spine. These reflections heightened my ingenuity in the search for an escape route. I had paid close attention to their entrance. Perhaps the act of locking the door had gone unnoticed. But was it also possible that this person had made a mistake? The key was missing. Would that be the case if the door was unlocked? Driven more by fear than hope, I decided to test it out. With trembling anticipation, I lifted the latch, and to my indescribable joy, the door opened. I quietly passed through and cautiously navigated my way to the staircase. Descending step by step, I eventually reached the ground floor. Although I couldn't remember the exact location of the door leading to the courtyard, I carefully felt along the wall with my hands until I found it. It was secured with multiple bolts and a lock. The bolts were easily withdrawn, but the key was nowhere to be found. I was uncertain where it had been placed. I thought I had arrived at the threshold of freedom, but now I faced an obstacle that seemed insurmountable. However, if doors could not be passed, perhaps windows could be unbarred. I recalled that my companion had entered a door on the left side in search of a light. I searched for that door, and fortunately it was only bolted. It granted me access to a room that I meticulously explored until I reached a window. I will spare the details of my efforts to remove the bars from this opening. It is enough to say that after much exertion and several missteps, I finally managed to make my way into the yard, and from there, into the courtyard. Chapter 5. I found myself back on the bustling streets, relieved to have successfully navigated away from the dangerous confines of someone else's land. It had taken a great deal of effort and anxiety to make my escape, but I was finally free. I had employed as many strategies to exit the house as one typically uses to enter it. Fear drove me to these measures, yet instead of leaving with any spoils, I had departed with the loss of an essential part of my attire. Now, with some respite, I took a seat on the ground and reflected on the recent events I had experienced. I began to question whether my efforts had been misdirected. What if I had encountered the individual upon their initial entry into the chamber? Was the truth so implausible that it would not have been believed? Since the door had been locked, with no other means of access, what explanation other than the truth could account for my presence there? Such conduct would have been consistent with an honest intention. Perhaps my betrayer had anticipated this outcome, believing that my rustic simplicity would not conceive of a more ambiguous or elaborate scheme. It's also possible that they had intended to intervene if my safety was genuinely at risk. Tomorrow, they would discover the 2 doors of the chamber and the window below left unclosed. They might suspect a burglary plot, but their searches would yield nothing more than a pair of clumsy, dust-covered shoes in the closet. Now that I was out of danger, I couldn't help but smile at the image my imagination conjured of their anxiety and bewilderment. However, these thoughts gave way to more pressing concerns. I couldn't fathom a more perfect embodiment of destitution than my current state. There was no one in the city to whom I could turn for assistance. I had no money, and what I wore comprised my entire possessions. Having just lost my shoes, my stockings had become useless. My dignity objected to embarking on a barefoot journey, but necessity forced me to reconcile with this predicament. I tossed my stockings through the bars of a stable window, presuming they belonged to the same estate I had just left. These, along with my shoes, I left behind as payment for my brief stay. It became apparent to me that the city was not a suitable place for my circumstances. The goal I had in mind, to secure some kind of manual labor, could only be achieved by taking action, but I was uncertain which path to pursue. The perils and deceptions I experienced during this night had soured my perception of city life, and my previous occupations now appeared enticing with countless imaginary charms. I promptly decided to venture into the countryside. The dawn of a new day was upon me. Being Sunday, I wished to avoid drawing attention to myself. Although I had gained some rest, the weariness from sleeplessness still weighed heavily upon me. I planned to find a patch of greenery where I could lie down and finally indulge in the sleep I desperately needed. Unfamiliar with the layout of the streets, I simply followed the one I had initially entered from the courtyard, trusting that by staying on this path, I would eventually reach the outskirts. As I later discovered, this street led towards Schuylkill, and soon took me away from the urban landscape. However, crossing the river required payment of a toll. It was necessary to cross in order to reach the desired countryside, but how could I manage the passage? I knew of no ford, and even the slightest expense exceeded my limited means. 10,000 guineas or a single farthing were equally distant from my possession, and I had been allotted nothing. Lost in contemplation, I turned onto one of the streets that led northward. It remained uninhabited and unpaved for a considerable distance. Eventually, I reached a paved road bordered by a painted fence, with a row of poplar trees planted alongside it. This fence enclosed a garden, and through a knothole, I peered inside. The enclosed garden before me was a delightful expanse of greenery, attached to a grand and imposing house. It appeared to be a recent construction, with a fresh and pristine appearance that dazzled my inexperienced eyes, evoking a sense of magnificence akin to palaces. In contrast, my father's humble abode could not even reach the height of a single story, and could easily fit within a quarter of these servant quarters. My heart couldn't help but draw a comparison between my own lowly circumstances and the privileged owners of this domain. The gap that separated us seemed immeasurable and insurmountable. This beautiful estate had fallen into the hands of someone who might squander it on frivolous luxury, while I, with noble intentions for the betterment of humanity, was destined to toil with flail and mattock. Such reflections were foreign to me. My books extolled the dignity and safety of a modest existence, and my favorite authors praised the virtues of rural life. From a distance, removed from opulence and ostentation, I regarded them in a favorable light. Yet, as I now stood closer, the towering buildings, the lavish furnishings, and the extravagant comforts of the wealthy stirred both admiration and envy within me. I relinquished my position by the fence and continued along, feeling disheartened. Eventually I approached the mansion itself. Its main entrance boasted a marble staircase, a material I had only heard of in relation to Carrara, Italy. The splendor of the poplar trees, the coolness emanating from the dew-kissed bricks, the inviting seat provided by the steps, and my uncertainty about my future path, all conspired to make me pause. I sat down on the bottom step, deep in contemplation. As I sat there, my thoughts took an unexpected turn. It occurred to me that the solution to my most pressing needs might lie within one of the inhabitants of this grand house. In my current situation, I required only a few cents, and what would a few cents mean to the occupant of such a mansion? I had an innate aversion to the role of a beggar, but I held an even stronger repulsion towards the path of a thief. Yet I found myself now cornered into considering these alternatives. Either I must steal or beg, unless I could somehow obtain assistance under the pretense of a loan. Would a stranger refuse to lend me the small sum I needed, especially if the urgency of my situation was explained? Surely not. However, other obstacles presented themselves. It would be absurd to summon the master of the house from his slumber for such a request. Instead of evoking his benevolence, I would be more likely to provoke his anger. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to direct my plea to a passer-by. As I pondered this, a servant emerged from the house carrying a bucket and a brush. This unexpected appearance forced me to make my departure sooner than I had intended. Reluctantly, I rose from my seat and resumed my journey. The house occupied the corner of the street, and I turned that corner, heading towards the countryside. In the distance, I noticed a person approaching from the opposite direction. I thought to myself, why not make my request to the first person I encounter? This individual seems capable of assisting, and there is nothing cold or austere about his demeanor. I was on the verge of deciding to address this passerby when, as he drew nearer, my resolve wavered. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, and didn't notice me until he was just a few paces away. If my appearance hadn't caught his eye, or if he had merely given me a passing glance, I wouldn't have mustered the courage to detain him. However, the unfolding of events turned out quite differently. He looked at me intently and was taken aback. At that moment, as if he needed a second glance to confirm what he saw, he momentarily paused in his stride. His reaction influenced mine, and I stopped, indicating my desire to address him. I spoke, my voice and demeanor betraying my embarrassment. I'm about to request a favor that is of utmost importance to me given my circumstances, and I hope it will be easy for you, sir, to grant it. It is not a handout, but a loan that I seek, a loan that I will repay as soon as I am able. I am heading to the country, but I lack the means to pay for my passage over Squealkill, or even to buy myself a bite to eat. May I venture to ask you, sir, for a loan of 6pence? I assure you, I intend to repay it. I delivered my plea with some hesitation but great earnestness. I emphasized my intention to return the money. He listened intently, his expression curious. His gaze traveled from my head to my feet. After a moment's pause, he responded in an emphatic tone. Why are you going to the country? Do you have family, relatives, friends? No, I replied. I have none of those. I'm seeking a way to sustain myself. I've spent my life working on a farm and intend to continue in the same condition until the end. Where have you come from? He inquired. I arrived in the city yesterday from the country, hoping to find some means of earning my livelihood, but I have since changed my plan and now intend to return. Why have you changed your plan? In what way are you capable of earning your livelihood? I'm not entirely certain, I admitted. As of now, I can handle no tool commonly used in the city, except for the pen. My past experiences have, to some extent, prepared me for writing. I would gladly accept such employment, I replied. He fixed his gaze on the ground for several minutes before regaining his composure and saying, Follow me to my home. Perhaps I can assist you in some way. If not, I can lend you 6pence. I eagerly accepted his invitation, and we walked in silence until we arrived at his home, which happened to be the very same house where I had been sitting outside. As we entered the parlor, I was struck by its grandeur and ornate decorations. I shall not attempt to describe the overwhelming impressions that flooded my senses, but suffice it to say that they were unlike anything I had ever experienced before. My companion then asked me to demonstrate my penmanship skills, to which I had devoted much time and effort. I sat down with the necessary implements and began to write. As I worked, a line from Shakespeare's writings came to mind, and I wrote, My poverty, but not my will, consents. This simple sentiment seemed to affect him deeply, although I could not understand why at the time. Later events revealed that he was impressed by my understanding and moral character. He then questioned me about my background and reasons for leaving my father's home, but I chose not to speak of my recent adventures from the night before. I saw no reason to share this information, and suspected that he would not believe me anyway. Throughout our conversation, there were moments of silence and contemplation as he reflected on my answers. Finally, he spoke again and said, I am in need of an amanuensis or copyist. What terms would you require to work for me? I was unsure of how to value my services and replied that I did not know. I was uncertain if these arrangements were suitable or beneficial. My existence had been active until now, and my constitution was prone to respiratory illnesses. The alteration may be harmful. Nevertheless, I was willing to attempt and satisfy myself for a month or a year, with only what was necessary for sustenance, clothing, and lodging. Very well, he responded. You will stay with me for as long as we both desire. You will reside and dine in this residence. I will provide you with apparel, and your responsibility will be to transcribe what I dictate. It appears that you have not given much attention to your appearance. I can outfit you instantly with the attire that is appropriate for a resident of this house. Follow me. He led me to the courtyard behind, and then to a tidy edifice that held large wooden containers and a pump. "There," he stated, "you may cleanse yourself. Once that is finished, I will guide you to your quarters and wardrobe." This was accomplished promptly, and he proceeded to lead me to my chamber. It was a room on the 3rd level, decorated and furnished in the same extravagant and luxurious manner as the rest of the house. He revealed closets and drawers overflowing with clothing and linens of all sorts and the highest quality. "These are yours," he declared, "for the duration of your stay. Dress yourself as you please. Everything you require for clothing is here. Once you are attired, you may proceed to breakfast." With those words, he departed. The attire was all in the French style, as I later discovered by comparing my clothing to that of others. They were tailored to my body with the utmost precision. I adorned myself with great care. I recalled the fashion of dress favored by my beloved Clavering. My tresses were a lustrous auburn, cascading and sleek like his. After squeezing the water out of my clothes and combing my hair, I carelessly tied it back with a black ribbon. Looking at myself in the mirror, I couldn't believe how different I looked. Dress really does have a powerful effect on appearances. My previous check shirt, fustian coat, check trousers, and bare feet were now replaced with linen and muslin, a nankeen coat with green stripes, a white silk waistcoat that was elegantly needle-wrought, casimere pantaloons, variegated silk stockings, and shoes that were as soft, pliant, and polished as satin. I was almost tempted to look behind me to check if the image in the mirror was really me. I looked so well-proportioned, gallant, and graceful that I could barely recognize myself. Walking to the window, I marveled at my transformation. Just 20 minutes ago, I said to myself, I was a barefoot beggar walking along that path, and now I look like this. I couldn't help but think that some sort of madness had taken over me. It felt like my senses were playing tricks on me. Perhaps some sort of magic had caused this change to happen so suddenly. Before I could ponder further, a black servant interrupted me with a summons to breakfast. I found my host, who I now knew as Welbeck, sitting at the breakfast table. He had an impressive collection of silver and china in front of him. When I walked in, he was taken aback by my appearance. For a moment, I think he was fooled by my new attire. He looked at me with a mix of surprise and confusion, as if wondering how I could have transformed so much in such a short amount of time. While he stared at me, I took the opportunity to examine him. He dressed neatly but without any unnecessary ornamentation. He had a medium build and was lean but still strong and graceful. His face seemed foreign to me, with a receding forehead that was more pronounced than any I had seen before. His eyes were large and prominent, but they didn't convey any sense of benevolence or joy. The man's face had a distinct convex edge, and his entire form filled me with feelings of respect and awe. He carried a gravity that bordered on sadness when we were alone. He whispered to the servant in attendance, who quickly left the room. He then turned to me and said, "A lady will arrive shortly, whom you must treat with the respect befitting my daughter. Do not be alarmed if she shows any emotion upon seeing you, and do not expect her to converse with you, as she does not understand your language." His words were barely out of his mouth when the lady entered. My unrefined upbringing left me feeling uneasy and nervous, but I managed to steal a glance at her. I was not skilled enough to capture her likeness, but it was as if the turban wrapped around her head, the exquisite texture of her clothing, and her nymph-like posture, rather than her physical attributes, gave her a heavenly aura. Perhaps it was her snowy complexion, or the shape of her features that made her so enchanting, or maybe it was simply my own lack of knowledge. She did not immediately notice me, but when she did, she let out a small shriek of surprise. She held up her hands and spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but her voice was beautifully melodic. Her emotions were difficult to contain, and she had trouble taking her eyes off of me. Though I couldn't understand their conversation, I watched their expressions closely, trying to glean any information I could. But like most things, I was an inexperienced novice in this art. In Welbeck's countenance, there was something more than just sympathy with the lady's astonishment and distress, but I couldn't decipher the additional meaning behind his expression. When the lady's attention was focused on Welbeck, her eyes would often wander or look downward, her cheeks flushed deeper, and her breath seemed to turn into a sigh. These were observations I made silently at the time. My own situation created confusion in my thoughts and clumsiness in my actions. After breakfast, the lady, seemingly at Welbeck's request, sat down at a pianoforte. Here again, I must remain silent. I possessed some musical knowledge and appreciation. I had enough understanding to recognize the exceptional skill of this performer. As if her touch wasn't enough to convey the depth of emotion, I discovered that the dissonant notes were softened by her own mellifluous voice. She played without sheet music, and while her bass might have been planned, it was evident that the notes she played with her right hand were spontaneous inspirations. Meanwhile, Welbeck stood nearby, leaning on the back of a chair, his gaze fixed on her face. His features carried a significance that I longed to decipher but couldn't. I've read about magical transitions, about palaces and deserts under the spell's dominion. Poets may play with their powers, but I'm certain that no transition conceived could be more marvelous and unforeseen than the one I had just experienced. Barren heaths tormented by a midnight storm might transform into a hall filled with singing nymphs and regal banquets. Forest clearings might suddenly give way to grand colonnades and joyous carnivals. But even when our senses are deceived, we still find ourselves on the same familiar earth where we were born. These wonders pale in comparison to the event that brought me to this abode and allowed me to take part in this gathering. I am aware that my sentiments may appear foolish to those who cannot comprehend the repercussions of a basic and rural upbringing. Chapter 6. After a brief moment, the lady retired. I couldn't help but anticipate some discussion about her peculiar behavior and the reason for her surprise and distress upon seeing me. However, Welbeck remained silent on the matter. Once she had left, he approached the window and stood there for a while, seemingly lost in thought. Eventually he turned to me and called me by my name, requesting that I follow him upstairs. His tone lacked any warmth or kindness, but he also didn't come across as domineering or arrogant. We entered a room on the same floor as my own, separated only by a wide hallway. It was furnished with bureaus, cabinets, and bookcases. This is our room, but we must enter and leave together. I don't intend to act as your master, but rather as your friend. Unfortunately, my maimed hand, he said, showing me his right hand which was missing its forefinger, prevents me from writing accurately or extensively. That's why I need your help with an important task. We won't need to rush, and the work hours will be reasonable and brief. Your current situation is new to you, so we'll postpone our work for now. In the meantime, feel free to occupy yourself however you like. Consider this house your home and make yourself comfortable. You can stay in or go out and be productive or lazy as you please. Just be sure to follow our household rules regarding eating and sleeping. The servants will explain those things to you. Next week we will begin the task I have prepared you for. You may now withdraw, he commanded. I obeyed his directive with some unease and hesitation. I retreated to my own chamber, not unhappy with the chance for solitude. I settled into a chair and surrendered myself to the thoughts that naturally arose in this situation. I pondered over the character and intentions of Welbeck. It was clear that he lived a life of tranquility and grandeur. He possessed wealth, but I questioned the nature of his riches and their source. What were the boundaries of his wealth, and how enduring was it? I was unaccustomed to the concept of wealth that could be easily transferred or moved. The income from properties and lands was the only type of possession that made perfect sense to me. Based on my initial assumptions, I regarded Welbeck as the owner of this residence, as well as numerous other houses and farms. I also imagined that he had inherited his wealth, and that his life had followed a predictable course. I then turned my attention to his social status. Apart from the servants, it appeared that only 2 individuals resided in this mansion. Who was the woman I briefly glimpsed? Had he not referred to her as his daughter? Their apparent age difference could support this claim, but her appearance, features, and mannerisms seemed foreign. I strongly suspected her language to be Italian. How could Welbeck be the father of an Italian woman? But perhaps there were also some foreign characteristics in his own countenance. This idea opened up a new realm of possibilities. From my readings, I had gained hazy knowledge of European governments and customs. I knew that this was a time of revolution and conflict. Could they be illustrious refugees from Provence or Milan? Perhaps they had brought their substantial wealth with them, which could explain the sorrow that seemed to cloud their faces. The loss of wealth and status, and the premature deaths of loved ones, including possibly his wife, are things that can cause endless regret. Welbeck spoke quickly and clearly, but I detected a slight foreign accent. This idea plagued my uneducated and unenlightened mind. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed plausible.